Hey everybody, welcome to the video. Let's go over the 9-game MLB DFS slate for today on Draftkings. Actually, take that back, it's only 8 games now because the Marlins and Orioles game did get canceled due to a lot of players testing positive, which is obviously not the greatest news in the world because we don't know what could snowball after that. So we just got to keep our fingers crossed that we can keep watching baseball for a while. But still got 8 games in the slate, so I am looking forward to it. But before we continue, as always, if you guys could just leave a like, and if you're new to the channel, you might as well hit that subscribe button because I'm going to be all season long trying to help you guys become better MLB DFS players and cover other sports as well. So if you're going to keep coming back to the channel each and every single day or each and every single week, you might as well hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell so you don't miss out whenever I post new content. You can also follow me over on Twitter, I'm at ChrisPennell16. You can follow me on IG at CPenn16. And if you want some more content over on Patreon, that's obviously much appreciated. You can get access to all the extra stuff I put out. And we have over 300 plus members now, which is incredible. So I do appreciate each and every single one of you guys. So yeah, if you're interested, hit the link in the description below. But if you're not, that's fine. Let's just dive into today's slate. So at pitching, there's not a lot of options I like. And as you can see, there's only 2 players listed here. And these are really the only guys I feel comfortable with. And I'm pretty sure most people are going to have the same thought process. I think these guys are going to be very highly owned, but it's pretty easy to fit them in. And we have plenty of value on the slate for the hitters. So pretty much do whatever you want once again because the pricing is once again soft. But we'll start with Tyler Glasnow, who I view as the ace of the slate. He comes in 8,900 and he only pitched 60 innings last year, but he was pretty incredible in those 60 innings. And Vegas likes him too. They have him at 7 strikeouts, 3.8 implied team total, and a 57% chance for a win. Now, the matchup versus Atlanta is not something I love. They got good hitters, obviously, in Acuna and Albies, but I still think Tyler Glasnow should have a pretty decent outing here. And if you're looking at his stats last season in 60 innings, he had a 1.78 ERA, which is incredible. Now, his xFIP was over a run higher at 2.94, but you can't complain about a 2.94 xFIP. That's still incredible numbers. 33% strikeout rate, low walk rate, really limited the hard contact at only 28% and only gave up 0.59 home runs per 9 innings, which is great. I love when my pitchers can limit the hard contact and still have a high strikeout rate. And he was good versus lefties and righties. Now, the matchup versus Atlanta is not my favorite. Near 200 ISO, 332 WOBA, over 100 WRC plus, but it's pitching in a good pitcher's park in Tampa Bay, and it's pretty spacious, and I think Tyler Glasnow should have a pretty good outing here. So I do like Glasnow as my ace of the slate. And then my favorite SP2 would be Josh James. He comes in at 8,600 going up against that weak Seattle offense, which I've been pretty much targeting pitchers against them. Now, I know Zach Greinke did not have the greatest day in the world yesterday at all, but I did prefer Trevor Bauer, so I actually didn't end up going with Greinke, but I still thought he would have a decent outing. I thought he was very safe. Just really did not perform, but I do like Josh James here. He's got more strikeout upside than Zach Greinke does. Now, when you're looking at his numbers, you got to keep in mind he did come out of the bullpen, so those strikeout numbers are going to be inflated because relief pitchers, they can strike guys out at a higher rate than starters, but still, overall, his numbers were pretty solid. And also, one thing to keep in mind is that most of these numbers are going to look red, but that's because it's comparing it to Glasnow, not overall of all the pitchers. If you had a bigger player pool here, Josh James' numbers would not be all red, so just something to keep in mind. And also, Vegas likes him, only 3.63 runs against him, 71% chance for a win, and 6.5 strikeouts, so I think Josh James is actually a really good SP2 here. He had 3.77 xFIP last year, 4.7 ERA, but his xFIP was about a run lower than his ERA, which means he got a little bit unlucky in that department. 38% strikeout rate. Now, he did struggle with walks and hard contact, which always does concern me. He had a double-digit walk rate. I didn't get a lot of ground balls, near 50% fly ball rate, 40% hard contact rate, and nearly 1.5 home runs per 9 innings. That's obviously a little concerning, but he's going up against a weak Seattle offense that did struggle with right-handed pitching last season. If you're looking at their splits, they struck out 26% of the time, and they're going up against a pretty high strikeout pitcher. So I think this does set up well for Josh James, and that's pretty much it I like for pitching. I mean, I kind of had minor interest in Warshawski, but obviously that's not going to happen anymore. So these are really the only 2 guys I like on this slate, and I think for now we can just move on to the batters, and we'll talk about them. So we'll start with the catcher position, and we have Wilson Contreras at 4,800, and I had a lot of Wilson Contreras yesterday, and I am very, very happy he hit that homer late in the game. It really boosted my lineups, and I had a nice twin stack too, so that lineup ended up doing very, very well. I stacked 1 through 5 with the Twins, and then I had Contreras, and obviously had the Bauer-Carrasco pairing, so that was a really good lineup. Unfortunately, Max Kepler didn't do anything, but I'll stop talking about yesterday. So Wilson Contreras going up against a lefty. He's got amazing numbers versus lefties, over a 300 ISO. Scroll over, 307 ISO, 161 WRC plus, 400 on base percentage. The numbers are going to be pretty good for Contreras here, a 320 batting average. Wade Miley's kind of got similar splits to lefties and righties. He's not a high strikeout pitcher, and we're in a really good hitter's park in Cincinnati. It's going to be pretty humid there, so I do think Wilson Contreras is a really good spend-up option. We also have JT Realmuto, who's also going to be hitting cleanup, 4,600 going up against J.A. Happ. Now, for J.A. Happ, he's not like a guy I like to really stack against for the most part, but you can certainly use righties against him. His splits versus righties are actually not that great whatsoever. He only gives up a 139 ISO to lefties, but a 235 ISO to righties, below 20% strikeout rate versus those guys, and gives up a good amount of fly balls, and over a 340 WOBA. So I do like the righties here for the Phillies, and JT Realmuto would be one of my top options, especially batting cleanup. And if you want to save some salary, we have two cheap options at catcher and Salvador Perez. He's 2,900 going up against Michael Fulmer. Now, Michael Fulmer is only supposed to be the opener, which means we will see a good amount of the Detroit bullpen. And I have not seen confirmation of who's going to come in afterwards, but I still think all these guys in the Royals are fine because no one really scares me from Detroit, whoever's going to come in after Fulmer. And even Fulmer's a year removed from injury, so even then I'm not really sure how Fulmer's going to look in his first start. But I just like where Perez is going to be hitting in the order, and he's also very cheap, and I actually think the Royals make a decent... You can get a lot of value in the Royals, and I don't hate that at all. Then you have Manny Pena here at 2,700. He's got some pretty decent splits versus lefties, and if you're going to use anyone from the Brewers, you're pretty much going to want the righties here versus Steven Brault. He doesn't have the greatest numbers versus righties. If you're looking at Pena's numbers versus lefties last season, 250 ISO, 146 WRC plus, near 400 on base percentage, near 400 WOBA. If we're looking at Brault's numbers versus righties, he gave up a 184 ISO, only a 17% strikeout rate, double-digit walk rate. So if you're going to use anybody versus Steven Brault, I would prefer the righties here. And we actually do have quite a few good righties on the Brewers that we could target. Going down to first base, we have Carlos Santana. He's 4,100. Now, Dylan Cease has a pretty decent strikeout rate, but he does give up power to lefties, and the Indians got plenty of good lefties in this lineup. So we're going to look at Santana's numbers versus righties last season. He had a 237 ISO, 381 on base percentage, 126 WRC plus. If you look at Cease's numbers versus lefties last season, he had a 21% strikeout rate, but a 257 ISO given up, and if you look at the righties, he actually had a 28.4% strikeout rate versus righties. So definitely like the splits for the lefties here, and again, the Indians have quite a few of them, and I actually think they make a pretty decent stack today, and they're not that expensive for the most part. Santana's not expensive, Cesar Hernandez is not expensive, Francisco Lindor's, he's up there, and so is Jose Ramirez, but I still think they make a pretty decent stack on this slate. I'm not too scared of Dylan Cease and his high strikeout numbers because a lot of these guys are lefties, and he did struggle with lefties last season. And then go up and down to Rhys Hoskins. He's 4,000. And like I said with JT Realmuto, I do prefer the righties here versus J.A. Happ. He did give up power versus them last season. And if you're looking at Hoskins splits versus lefties last year, he had some excellent numbers. A 152 WRC plus, a 275 ISO, a 407 WOBA. So I do think Rhys Hoskins is a pretty good option. He's only at 4K too, so I do think he is a pretty solid value as well. Then we have Ji-Man Choi, should be leading off at 3,900 versus Folty. And Folty did struggle with lefties last season. If we look at his splits, he gave up a 223 ISO versus them and less than a 20% strikeout rate. And he did give up a lot of fly balls as well. And Ji-Man Choi actually has some really good splits versus righties. If you look at his numbers, he's got a 219 ISO, 377 on base percentage, 360 WOBA, 132 WRC plus. Very solid numbers for Ji-Man Choi versus right-handed pitching. So I do think he is a pretty solid option. I don't like the park that they're in, but I still think he's fine if you're looking for a value first baseman. And then we have Mitch Moreland. He comes in at 3,700. And I know you guys are probably tired of the Red Sox. I stacked them yesterday too in one of my lineups, and they just did not really do anything. Vasquez hit a homer, and so did Kevin Pillar, but JD Martinez blanked. And I mean, for the most part, they were pretty trashy. I mean, they've been struggling versus the Orioles. I mean, especially their pitching as well. But Michael Wacha is not a guy I want to stack against, but I still think we can use some one-offs here, especially since they're in Boston, which is a good hitter's park. And Mitch Moreland did homer his one game so far this season versus a righty. And if you look at Moreland's numbers versus right-handed pitching, I mean, he's got some pretty solid numbers, a near 300 ISO, 125 WRC plus, near 550 slugging. And if you look at Wacha's numbers, he actually gave up more power to righties last season, but overall his numbers weren't that great. Still a 200 ISO to lefties, less than a 20% strikeout rate, and a double-digit walk rate to lefties. So don't mind the lefties here in Boston. I also think you can use the righties as well. I feel like people are going to be staying away from Boston because they've kind of burned you the past 2 days, and they're also not going up against the trash Orioles. And Michael Wacha is not someone everyone wants to stack against. So I do think the Red Sox make a decent bounce-back sneaky stack, if that makes any sense, because I don't think a lot of people are going to be on them. And I mean, I'm not the highest on them, but if you want some lower ownership with the team that's definitely got some pop, I wouldn't hate the Red Sox there. Then we have Yuli Gurriel. He's going up against Kendall Graveman. Now, we're not going to have any splits for Kendall Graveman because he did not pitch last year, but looking at his career numbers, he struggled versus righties and lefties. Does not have a high strikeout rate, so I do think the whole Astros lineup is in play here. Now, they are very expensive, so I do just kind of prefer picking the cheaper options in this lineup, and Yuli Gurriel does qualify. And Gurriel actually has some really good splits versus righties, too. He actually has a lot more better stats. He's got a lot better stats versus righties than he does lefties. He's got a 244 ISO versus right-handed pitching, a near 400 WOBA, 140 WRC plus, a near 600 slugging, a 320 batting average versus righties. So I think Yuli Gurriel is a pretty solid option in the Astros stack that I believe is going to have one of the highest implied team totals on this slate. It's near 6. Now, there's a couple of games that aren't out yet, but I would have to imagine the Astros might have the top spot today. So, yeah, I do like Yuli Gurriel. And if you want a value option at first base, I think CJ Cron's an excellent option here at 3,300. He's on Detroit now, no longer on the Twins, but he crushed left-handed pitching last season. And Mike Montgomery's going to be on the mound here. And if you're looking at CJ Cron's numbers versus lefties last season, they were very, very good. A 310 ISO. I always played him on the Twins when there was a lefty. Like, the guy was just absolute money. He had a 160 WRC plus versus them, a 325 batting average. I mean, the numbers just check out for CJ Cron. If you're looking at Mike Montgomery's splits versus righties, the numbers just aren't going to be very good. Only an 18% strikeout rate, 211 ISO, 350 WOBA. Now, his splits versus lefties were actually kind of worse, but he had a higher walk rate versus righties, and overall, I'm not really scared of Mike Montgomery or that bullpen, so I do think CJ Cron, who should be batting cleanup, is a very solid option there. Now, going down to second base, there's not a lot I like at second base at all. I mean, you can play Jose Altuve, but I just don't love paying $5K for Altuve, especially versus righty, because he's got much better numbers versus lefties. But so for the most part, I just have some value options here. But we have Nico Goodrum, 4,300. He's got some good splits versus lefties. I mean, he doesn't have the most power in the world, 155 ISO, but 388 WOBA, 411 on base percentage, 143 WRC plus, and he had a 361 batting average versus lefties last season. So should be leading off. I think Nico Goodrum is a decent option. I mean, not like someone that jumps off the page, but I do think he's fine. Cesar Hernandez, he's 3,900. I actually really like him. He's got much better splits versus right-handed pitching this season. And I do have quite a bit of interest in the Indian stack. And they finally started hitting last game as well. They put up, I think, 9 runs. So finally got some hitting in. They haven't really been producing too much, but they finally got it going. And 3,900, he's got better splits versus righties. He's got near 300 batting average versus them, a 342 on base percentage. Doesn't have a lot of power in his bat, but I'm kind of just hoping he gets on base, gets some runs, that kind of deal. So I think Cesar Hernandez, 3,900, is definitely a pretty good option, and I could see him carrying some ownership as well. And then at second base, we also have Jonathan Scope. I've never really remembered how to say this guy's name, but it's one of those 3. So just whatever one you prefer, you can roll with it. You can let me know in the comments, because someone told me last year, I've never heard his name on TV. I know the guy's got some pop in his bat, but I just cannot remember how to say his last name. But 3,400 going against Mike Montgomery, and he's got some pretty good numbers versus lefties. He's got a 286 ISO, 136 WRC plus, over a 550 slugging, and Mike Montgomery, not the best pitcher in the world, so I think Jonathan Scope, whatever you want to call him at 3,400 is actually a pretty decent option. Going on to third base, we actually have some heavy hitters here that I think are pretty interesting. We have Chris Bryant, 5,500, in Great American Ballpark going up against Wade Miley. Wade Miley's not the worst pitcher in the world, but he's not the best either, and I do like Chris Bryant versus lefties. He's got elite numbers versus them, so if you're looking at his splits, he's got a 333 ISO versus them, a 432 WOBA, 426 on base percentage, 169 WRC plus, over a 600 slugging. I like the spot for Chris Bryant quite a bit. Now, he is super expensive, so it's hard to call him a great play because it's really going to be tough to fit him in your lineups, and I'm not really looking to stack the Cubs here, so he's a good one-off, but I do like the individual spot for Chris Bryant here, so I do think he's interesting. Jose Ramirez, he's 5,000. He went double dong yesterday, which probably boosts his ownership just because people are looking at game logs. They're going to see he scored a bunch of points, so it makes sense, but this is a pretty good spot for him, and I do prefer pretty much all the Indians here versus right-handed pitching, and that's what we're going to get with Dylan Cease. And he does struggle with lefty power, and the Indians certainly got a ton of that in the beginning of the lineup. So if you're looking at Jose Ramirez's splits versus righties last season, he had a 239 ISO, 338 WOBA, 107 WRC plus, just solid numbers all around, and Cease does struggle with lefties, so I do think Jose Ramirez is a good option, and Jose Ramirez is a guy that can definitely be streaky. He can get on hot stretches, and he can get on down stretches, and he had 2 homers yesterday, so maybe it's the beginning of a hot stretch. I'm not sure, but it is encouraging to see, so I do like J-Ram, especially in Indian stacks. If you're stacking the Indians, you can't leave J-Ram off, just like you can't leave Lindor off, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Dropping down to Eugenio Suarez, he's 4,600, and he's going up against a lefty and John Lester, and anytime Suarez is going up against a lefty, I always have interest. I know John Lester is not the worst pitcher in the world at all, but still, Suarez numbers versus lefties are too good to pass up. He got a 301 ISO versus them, a 417 on base percentage, 149 WRC plus. If you're looking at Lester splits versus lefties and righties, I mean, he's not a bad pitcher. He doesn't have the highest strikeout rate in the world, doesn't give up a ton of power, but he does give up more power to righties at a 183 ISO and a 340 WOBA. So I do think Suarez is a fine option. We're also in a really friendly hitter's park in Great American Ballpark. It's going to be humid there, around 80 degrees, which I know it's not like a 90 plus, but it's still going to be warm and humid. So definitely some decent hitting conditions there. And then we have Gene Segura, who's eligible at at shortstop as well. And he's really cheap. He's going up against a lefty. And Segura had really good numbers versus lefties last season. And I do like the righties here versus J.A. Happ. I wouldn't even mind a little righty stack for the Phillies. And if you want to stack the Phillies, you could also use Bryce Harper as well. But I prefer the righties for the most part. But Segura's numbers versus lefties last season, he had a 274 ISO, 371 WOBA, 129 WRC plus. Much better splits compared to what he did versus righties, where he was at 100 ISO, 81 WRC plus, just overall pretty bad numbers. So I do like Segura here. He's really cheap, and I think it's a good lefty on righty matchup here. Or I guess you want to say righty on lefty matchup here. Then Matt Davidson, he is absolutely free. He's 2,100. Now he doesn't have any stats from last year because he did not play last year, but I do prefer the righties versus John Lester, and he should be hitting in the middle of that order. It's a hitter-friendly park, and he is dirt cheap. If you need value, Matt Davidson, righty on lefty matchup, did have some pop in 2018. I don't mind it. Not my favorite option in the world, but he is 2,100, so you really can't complain. You're just kind of hoping for a hit there. Dropping down to I almost wanted to call that second base again. Shortstop, we have Frankie Lindor, 4,900. I like the Indians quite a bit today, one of my top stacks on the slate. And I do prefer him versus right-handed pitching. He's got much better splits versus them. He's got 263 ISO, 359 WOBA, 121 WRC plus, over a 550 slugging. Just overall really good numbers versus righties. Dylan Cease did struggle with lefties, lower strikeout rate, more power given up. So Frankie Lindor does make a lot of sense to me. Then we have Javi Baez, 4,700. He had great splits versus lefties last season, and sound like a broken record here, but this is a good park for hitting, and I do like the righties on the Cubs here. He had 314 ISO versus lefties last season, 142 WRC plus, 618 slugging. If you want to stack Chris Bryant and Javi Baez up, I don't mind that at all. Then you have Carlos Correa, who actually had better splits versus righties last season. He was reverse splitsy, and Kendall Graveman has struggled versus righties and lefties, but just looking at his splits, it looks like he struggled a little bit more with the righties, so you get a double reverse splits matchup there. But either way, I think the Astros should have their way with Kendall Graveman. I don't expect him to really do much damage to this lineup, and they are one of the top stacks on the slate, but I do prefer the cheaper options for the Astros, so that's why I had Yuli Gurriel listed here and Carlos Correa, and I will talk about Michael Brantley in a little bit and Josh Reddick, but I like Carlos Correa. He had a 307 ISO versus righties last season, 137 WRC plus, 577 slugging, and I'm not going to have any numbers here for Kendall Graveman because I'm using 2019 statistics, but I think the Astros are going to be fine here, and Carlos Correa actually does come in at a pretty decent price point. And then we have Didi Gregorius at 3,400 at shortstop. Now, I have him listed here because I think people are going to play righties versus J.A. Happ. But I've said this before this season, don't leave Didi Gregorius off stacks versus lefties because he's got better numbers versus lefties. I mean, they're not like fantastic, but they are slightly better splits and more power. So versus left-handed pitching, he's got a 250 ISO compared to a 186 ISO against righties and a 303 WOBA, 87 WRC plus. Just overall, his numbers are better versus lefties. So if you're going to stack up some Phillies, and I wouldn't leave off Didi Gregorius, and you can play him and Segura together because Segura is eligible at third base as well, and you can play Didi at shortstop. So if you're stacking Phillies, I wouldn't leave Didi off because I think people are going to skip him just because it's a lefty-on-lefty matchup, and people just tend to skip those. So wouldn't leave off Didi in full Philly stacks. And then Jose Peraza, just because he's cheap and on Boston, and I don't want to quit them yet. I know a lot of people probably do, but man, he was hitting leadoff yesterday and just did absolutely nothing. I mean, Boston just straight up sucked, but Michael Wacha actually did give up more power to righties last season if you're looking at his splits. Let's see, 196 ISO versus lefties, but a 224 ISO versus righties, a higher WOBA as well, and pretty much the same strikeout rate, lower walk rate, but overall Michael Wacha is not the greatest pitcher in the world, and he's cheap on Boston. They're at home. I mean, I still like him. He's really cheap. You're just playing him if you want some value. He's also eligible at second base as well. In the outfield, there wasn't too much I liked up top. I wasn't originally going to have JD Martinez here, but he was below 5K, and it just felt weird leaving JD Martinez off because he's one of my favorite guys to roster. So I put him on here, 4,700, going up against Michael Wacha. Now, JD's a guy I always want to use versus lefties because he's got astronomical numbers versus left-handed pitching, as you guys can see here, all the dark green bars. And if you compare that to righties, his numbers do go down quite a bit, 177 ISO, 103 WRC plus. But since Wacha does give more power to righties, and if you want to stack Boston up, if you want to go back and try to get some ownership on those guys, I don't hate it. Again, it's not my favorite thing in the world, but if you want to lower your own stack, I think it's fine. And JD Martinez has got pop. I mean, you can go deep off of anyone, so I don't mind JD. But Nick Castellanos, he's 4,500, and I love Nick Castellanos versus lefties because he has some really good splits versus them. So if we take a look-see at his splits versus lefties, he had a 343 ISO versus them last season, a 460 WOBA, 190 WRC plus, almost JD-like numbers. Now, really no one's as good as JD is versus lefties, but he's still got really good numbers. Now, he's in a really good hitter's park in Cincinnati going up against a lefty and John Lester, who did give up more power righties. Should be hitting cleanup, 4,500. I think Castellanos is in an excellent spot here. Then we have Aaron Hicks at 4,300. Plus my spot. But he goes going up against Jake Arrieta, and Aaron Hicks has better splits versus righties than he does lefties, so I do think he's an interesting option. He had a 261 ISO versus right-handed pitching last season, 115 WRC plus. If you're looking at Arrieta's splits versus lefties and righties, you obviously want to use the lefties versus Jake Arrieta, and Aaron Hicks is a switch hitter, so obviously he will have the advantage there. He had a 221 ISO to lefties last season compared to 115 versus righties. Strikeout rate of only 15%, double-digit walk rate. You really want lefties versus Jake Arrieta, and Aaron Hicks would qualify there. Then you have Andrew McCutchen at 4,200. This is pretty much just a righty versus J.A. Happ, and I don't hate a little Philly stack versus Happ because the righties do grade out well here, and McCutchen's pretty cheap, should be leading off here. So I don't mind McCutchen. I mean, he's not my most favorite player in the world, and he actually had better splits versus righties last season if you're looking at his numbers. He had a 118 ISO versus lefties compared to a 226 ISO versus righties, but for the most part here, you want right-handed bats versus J.A. Happ, and McCutchen would qualify. Then we have Ryan Braun, 4,200, and I love using Ryan Braun versus lefties because he just tends to crush them. If you're looking at his splits last season, he had a 287 ISO versus them, a 384 WOBA, 136 WRC plus, and over a 550 slugging. So I do like Ryan Braun. He's pretty cheap, should be hitting in the heart of that order, and I do like the righties from the Brewers against Steven Brault, who's just not that great of a pitcher, especially versus right-handed bats. If you're looking at his splits, Steven Brault is giving up a 184 ISO versus them, only a 17% strikeout rate and a double-digit walk rate. So I do think all the righties for the Brewers are in play. And same exact thing can be said for Lorenzo Cain here. He's 3,700, and I actually think he could be leading off here. So, I mean, that would obviously boost his numbers even more. Now, he doesn't have a ton of power or anything. Only a 157 ISO versus lefties, 92 WRC plus. But I just think he's a good option. He's got speed too, so he has stolen base upside. And especially if he's leading off, I'll definitely have interest, especially at 3,700. They have Andrew Benintendi. He should be leading off here versus the righty, and the guy's just been absolutely awful this season. And besides one game, the Red Sox have been pretty awful for the most part, but he's still going up against a righty. He's dirt cheap, leading off. I think the Red Sox have some potential here. Michael Wacha does not scare me too much. He's not a high strikeout pitcher. He actually walks a lot of the lefties at nearly 12%, near 200 ISO given up to them. And I know Benintendi's been pretty horrendous so far, but I like the price. I like that he's leading off, and he's fine. But one of my favorite plays on the entire slate, which I know is to no one's surprise, but it is Michael Brantley at 3,300. I just love playing Michael Brantley because he's hitting on a good team. He's batting cleanup. He gets that lefty on righty matchup, and he's just got one of the smoothest, beautiful swings in baseball, and he's a very, very high contact hitter. So that's one of the reasons I love Brantley, because if you're looking at a strikeout rate versus righties, he only strikes out 8% of the time versus righties. Guys that can put the ball in play for me are definitely usually on the top of my radar because that makes them safer plays, especially in cash games. And if you're looking at splits versus righties, they are very, very good. I mean, you're seeing dark shades of green here. 226 ISO, 385 WOBA, 380 on base percentage, 146 WRC plus, over a 500 slugging, and a 323 batting average versus righties, and that low strikeout rate. I think the Astros are one of the best stacks on the slate, and if you can get their cleanup hitter at 3,300, I mean, that's just an absolute steal. He's one of the top options on the entire slate, and he's pretty much going to grade out as one of the best value options on the entire slate, or the best value overall on the slate. So, love Michael Brantley. Also like Phillip Ervin here, Ervin at 3,000. He is dirt cheap, should be leading off versus the lefty and John Lester, and it's a good hitter's park. I've said it multiple times, but I do like the righties here. And if you're looking at Ervin's splits versus lefties last season, he had a 280 ISO, 428 WOBA, 411 on base percentage, 164 WRC plus, and a 350 batting average versus them. So Ervin makes some sense. He's really cheap as well. And like I said, lots of good value options on this slate. So shouldn't be too pressed to be able to make lineups today. So I do like Ervin. Then Josh Reddick, just a cheaper part of that Astro stack that I said I like today. And if you're looking at his splits versus righties, they're not great or anything, but it's just a cheap part of the Astros. If you don't want to spend top dollar for Altuve, Springer, Bregman, those kind of guys, you can take the cheap options, and they should still be able to produce. I'm not really that scared of Kendall Graveman in the slightest. And if you're looking at Reddick's numbers versus righties last season, they're not great. 120 ISO, 295 WOBA. I mean, numbers aren't fantastic, but I still think he's a fine option at 2,700. But I think that's going to be pretty much it for the video, guys. So if you made it through, awesome. I do appreciate you guys watching. And if you're new to the channel, like I said, hit that subscribe button. It really does help me out. If you haven't already, leave a like, follow me on Twitter, support me on Patreon, all that fun stuff. But that's going to be it for the video. Thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.